Hare Krishna. Is my screen visible?
Yes, Hare Krishna Prabhu, your screen is visible.
Okay. So we'll start with the Mangalacharan. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chakshurumilitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namah Sri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Tapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Gadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeyam Sri Guru Sri Yuddhapadakamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavamsha Sri Rupam Sagrajatam Sagana Raghunathan Vitam Stam Sajivam Advaitam Savadutam Parjana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sagana Lalita Sri Vishakan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpati Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namaste Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhi Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanusude Devi Pranamami Haripe Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Sri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Rama Hare Hare Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Hare Krishna. Thanks for attending today's session. So today's title is Īśāvāsyam Idaḿ Sarvaṁ, Supreme Proprietorship. So actually this title, it is actually part of the first mantra of Īśāvāsyam. So we'll actually be looking at Īśāvāsyam, but we'll also be seeing how the Bhagavad Gita is actually related to Īśāvāsyam and also the other Upanishads, but our focus will mainly be on Īśāvāsyam. So the Vedic literature, we know that there are four, the most commonly known Vedas, Rig, Yajur, Sama, Atharva. But for each of the Vedas, they consist of four sections or the four components. Each of those Vedas, they consist of four main portions known as Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishads. So the Upanishads are actually part of the Vedas. The Upanishads are actually a component of every Veda. The first three sections, Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, they belong to the Karma Kanda section, and Upanishads belong to the Jnana Kanda section. So the word Veda itself, it comes from the root word with meaning to know. So commonly the word Veda refers to knowledge, but regarding what knowledge? So Veda is that which conveys knowledge about Dharma and Dharmam and Brahmam. Vedayati Dharmam Brahmam cha Vedaha. Veda is that which imparts knowledge about Dharma and the Supreme Brahman. Now for Samhitas are collections of suktas, and suktas are collections of mantras. Brahmanas are mantras and rules for sacrifice written in prose format. Aranyakas are similar to Brahmanas, but these three sections of each Veda, they belong to the Karmakanda section. So we have also seen from the Bhagavad Gita that the Karmakanda portions are often meant for fruitive activities, for which there are rewards, there are heavenly rewards. But we also know that from chapter 9 of the Gita that once the piety which is accumulated through all these Karmakanda activities expires, we still have to return to this earthly planet from heaven. So Jnana Kanda, it actually helps us to develop our knowledge about the Supreme Brahman. Upanishad consists of two parts of the word Upa and Nishidati. Upa means near, Nishidati means to bring. So Upanishad brings us nearer to Brahma Vidya, which is also known as Rahasya Vidya. Brahma Vidya means knowledge about the Supreme Brahman, Param Brahma. And it is also known as Rahasya Vidya because the knowledge in the Vedas, especially in the Upanishads, since it belongs to the Shruti part of Vedic literature, the Shrutis are often in a very confidential and encoded format. It is not easy to understand the meaning of the Upanishads. So that's why we have our, like in our Sampradaya, for the Dvaita school of thought, we have commentaries by Madhvacharya. So we can only understand the meanings of this Rahasya Vidya through the commentaries of our Acharyas. Actually, not just for Shrutis, even for Smritis. Bhagavad Gita is part of the Mahabharata. So even to understand Bhagavad Gita, we still need the translations and purports by Acharyas like Srila Prabhupada. But compared to Smritis, the Shrutis are even more confidential. The language used to encode the knowledge in Smritis like Upanishads are very cryptic. So for that, the commentaries by Acharyas becomes even more important to understand that. And apart from the usual Shruti Smriti classification, we also have this Prasthana Traya classification, which consists of Shruti Prasthan, Smriti Prasthan, and Nyaya Prasthan. Shruti Prasthan refers to the Upanishads. Smriti Prasthan refers to Smritis like Bhagavad Gita. And Nyaya Prasthan refers to Brahma Sutra or Vedanta Sutra. Prasthana means the source of authoritative and authentic knowledge. Nyaya Prasthan, like Vedanta Sutra, it is based on logic. The Vedanta Sutra consists of encode the meaning of the Upanishads. So though there are many classifications for all these different sources of knowledge, it's not like they are all different. They are just different classes based on how they have been presented. Like as mentioned earlier, the Shrutis are in a more cryptic format, so it's not easy to understand the Upanishads. But Smritis like Bhagavad Gita are more easier to be understood. And from this session, we'll also see how the Bhagavad Gita is related to the Upanishads like Īśāvāsyam. The essence of the Upanishads have also been conveyed in the Bhagavad Gita itself in a very comprehensive way. So compared to studying the Upanishads, even if we study the Bhagavad Gita, we can actually capture the essence of all the Upanishads. And this is another classification which shows the location of the Upanishads. As mentioned earlier, the Vedas, in every Veda, there are different sections like Samhita, Brahmana, Aranyaka, and Upanishads. So each of these Upanishads, they belong to specific Vedas, like Aitreya Upanishad, it belongs to Rig Veda. Īśāvāsyam, which is also known as Isha or Īśāvāsyam Upanishad, and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad belongs to the Shukla Yajurveda. So these, there are 10 principal Upanishads. Actually, if we look at the entire collection of Vedic literature, now we only have 6% of the original collection of the entire Vedic literature, which consists of thousands of Samhitas, Brahmanas, and Aranyakas. And for those components, by right, there should be at least one Upanishad. So originally, in the original collection of the entire Vedic literature, there's supposed to be thousands of Upanishads, but out of all that, 108 Upanishads have been identified as the principal ones. But even out of those 108, 10 have been identified as the principal Upanishads, like Aitreya, Isha, Kena, Kata, Prashna, Mundaka, Mandukya, Taitriya, Aitreya, Chandogya, and Brihadaranyaka Upanishads. So these 10 are the most principal ones out of the 108. But even out of these 10, Īśāvāsyam is the foremost one. And if we look at the Bhagavad Gita as it is in the intro section, towards the end of the intro section, before we see the list of disciplic succession, there's this Gita Mahatmya portion. There are 7 slokas in Gita Mahatmya, and the 6th sloka goes like this: Sarvo Panishado Gavo Dokta Gopala Nandana Palto Vatsa Sudhir Bhokta Dugdam Gita Mradam Mad. The Bhagavad Gita is the essence of all the Upanishads. So by delivering the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna has actually compressed the entire knowledge of the Upanishads in a way which is much more easier for us to understand compared to studying the Upanishads itself. So though there are many classifications of these Vedic literature, as mentioned earlier, the Shrutis are much more difficult to understand because of the cryptic knowledge. But even by studying the Bhagavad Gita, we can still capture the essence of all the Upanishads. So that is what is meant by this verse from Gita Mahatmya. And today we'll also be looking at how the mantras in Īśāvāsyam also convey the same meaning of what is conveyed through the Bhagavad Gita. So as mentioned earlier, the Upanishads deal with Brahma Vidya. So we'll just go through a quick recap about the concept of Brahman. We have already seen these details in one of our previous sessions titled Param Brahma, Supreme Brahman. So this is just a quick recap. The root word of Brahman comes from Brihat or Brihati, which means to grow or to expand. So the entire creation, whether it's the spiritual world or the material world, everything was created through the expansion of the Supreme Brahman. And we have also seen this in the same session on Param Brahma, Supreme Brahman. In 10.8, Krishna says, I am the source of all spiritual and material world. Everything emanates from me. So if we look at the Goloka chart, at the topmost region, it consists of Goloka Vrindavan, which is actually part of the Goloka region. The Goloka region itself is divided into Goloka Vrindavan, Mathura, and Dwarka. So Krishna is there in Goloka Vrindavan in his Swayam Rupa, and there are many expansions which occupy all the other regions like Mathura and Dwarka. And in the Goloka region, we have the Adi Chaturvyuha. So from this Adi Chaturvyuha, Adi Sankarshan, the primary Sankarshan, becomes the source for expansion in the Vaikuntha region. So in the Vaikuntha region, the Narayana form occupies all the other innumerable Vaikuntha planets in the 400 form. So these regions form the spiritual world. It is also stated in the Bhagavatam that the spiritual world consists of 3/4 or 3-part vibhuti of the entire creation. The Supreme Lord's energy, out of the total energy of the Supreme Lord, 3/4 of it makes up the spiritual world. Then below the Vaikuntha region, the Dvitiya Chaturyuha or secondary Chaturyuha or secondary Sankarshan becomes the source for avatars in the material world. So when Krishna's expansions from the spiritual world descends to the material world, then all these different categories of avatars are formed. These details we can find from the 3rd chapter of Bhagavatam, chapter 3 of the 1st canto. So the Supreme Lord pervades the entire creation, whether it's the spiritual world or material world, through his various expansions and avatars. Avatars are actually expansions which descend to the material world. The expansions in the spiritual world, they are known as expansions, but when they descend to the material world, they are known as avatars. In Bhagavatam 2:6-19, it's also stated that the material energy of the Supreme Lord or the material creation is made up of 1/4 of the Supreme Lord's energy, meaning Ekapada Vibhuti. Previously, it was 3-part Vibhuti, 3/4 that formed the spiritual world. Ekapada Vibhuti, 1/4 forms the material world. So the root word Brahma or Brahman can be decleansed into all these different formats. So we have these 3 important words which have related meanings: Brahman, Brahma, and Brahmana. So Brahman actually refers to Parabrahma, the Supreme Brahman. Brahma is the topmost living entity, the topmost Jiva Tattva, who is also known as Hiranyagarbha, who is born out of Garbhodaya Vishnu in the material universe. And Brahmana is the person who knows about Brahman. Brahma Jana iti Brahmana. So Brahmana is the one who knows about the Supreme Brahman, and he is engaged in the occupation of imparting knowledge about the Supreme Brahman. So even in the 5th chapter of 2nd canto, in the conversation between Lord Brahma and Narada Muni, Lord Brahma tells Narada Muni that he merely engages in the process of sub-creation, meaning that he tells Narada Muni that he only discovers what has already been created by the Supreme Brahman or Krishna, because just like we have 5 principal subject matters in the Bhagavad Gita, like Ishvara Jiva Prakriti, Kala Karma, there are 10 subject matters in the Bhagavatam. Atra Sargo Visargasya Sthanam Posna Mutaya Manvantara Ishanu Kada Nirodha Mukti Rashraya. So there are these 10 subject matters, out of which the first 2 are Sarga and Visarga. Sarga refers to creation. Visarga is like secondary creation, in which Brahma actually works. So Brahma's task is preceded by creation, which is done by the Supreme Lord, by the Supreme Brahman. So Brahma himself admits, though he is known as the only God who is engaged in creation, but Brahma himself admits that he himself is subservient to the Supreme Brahman. Then also in Gita 10.12, Arjuna says, Param Brahma Param Dhamma Pavitram Paramam Bhavan Purusham Shashvatam Divyam Adi Devam Madhyamam. So Arjuna says, he refers to Krishna as Param Brahma, the Supreme Brahman, but it is not merely his own assertion. He mentions it based on what the sages have said, like Narada, Sita, Devala, Vyasa. So that was just a quick recap about the concept of Supreme Brahman. And this is the outline of how we are going to cover the Īśāvāsyam in relation to the Bhagavad Gita. So there are 9 sections. Today we will be looking at the first 2 sections, meaning mantra 1 and 2. So first, regarding this invocation mantra, there is a specific invocation mantra for all the different Vedas. Like as we saw earlier, Īśāvāsyam and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, they are part of the Shukla Yajurveda. So because of that, Īśāvāsyam and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad have the same invocation mantra. This mantra, Om Purnamada, for the other Upanishads which belong to the different Vedas, like Aitreya Upanishad belongs to the Rig Veda. So for that, there is a different mantra. So now for Īśāvāsyam and Brihadaranyaka Upanishads, they belong to Shukla Yajurveda. Both the Upanishads use this particular mantra. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnam Mudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnam Eva Vasishyate. The personality of Godhead is perfect and complete, and because he is completely perfect, all emanations from him, such as this phenomenal world, are perfectly equipped as complete wholes. Whatever is produced of the complete whole is also complete in itself. Because he is the complete whole, even though so many complete units emanate from him, he remains the complete balance. In the purport, the complete whole or supreme absolute truth is the complete personality of Godhead. So the Supreme Brahman refers to the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is Satchidananda Vigraha. So we have already seen this from Brahma Samhita 5.1, where Brahma himself says, Ishvara Paramakrishna Satchidananda Vigraha. So the Supreme Personality of Godhead, or the complete whole, or the Supreme Absolute Truth, who represents the Supreme Brahman, is Satchidananda Vigraha, who has a form. The impersonal Brahman is merely the Sat feature, which represents eternity. It is only one out of the 3 complete features. Paramatma realization covers the Sat and Chit features, which are related to aspects of eternity and knowledge. Only the personality of Godhead, Bhagavan realization, covers all 3 Sat Chit Ananda features. So this Satchidananda Vigraha refers to the form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and it is simple logic to understand this, because the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Bhagavan, who has a form, can have a subset, which is the impersonal Brahman, but it cannot be the other way around. It cannot be like the impersonal whole having a subset of a personal form. So this has already been explained by Krishna himself in Gita 7.24, where he says that only the less intelligent people think that he was formless and he has taken this human-like form. So the original form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is that of Satchidananda Vigraha, and the impersonal Brahman feature is merely a subset of the complete features. So we have also seen details regarding these 3 features, Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan realization. This is explained in Gita 2.2, the purport of Gita 2.2, and also in Bhagavatam 1-11. The complete whole personality of Godhead has immense potencies. The 24 elements of this material universe is a temporary manifestation. The universe functions on its own time scale, which is fixed by the energy of the complete whole. So this entire material universe, it is known as material universe because it is composed of matter, and the entire material universe is composed of the same set of 24 elements, meaning the raw ingredients. So we have seen that in our previous session titled Mahatattva. So the details are also given there. When the material universe is in its unmanifest state, it is known as Pradhana. But when it becomes manifest, it is known as Prakriti. So we know that even during the day of Brahma, during the daytime, the material universe becomes manifest. But during the night of Brahma, it goes into the unmanifest state. And regarding the 24 elements, there are 5 gross, 5 subtle elements, 4 internal senses, 5 senses for gathering knowledge, Jnana Indriya, and 5 senses for action, Karma Indriya. So the 5 gross elements, earth, water, fire, air, and ether. The subtle elements, smell, taste, color, touch, and sound. Senses for acquiring knowledge, Jnana Indriya. Organs for action, Karma Indriya, 5 each. And the 4 internal senses, mind, intelligence, false ego, and contaminated consciousness. So total, we have the 24 elements which lead to the creation of this entire material universe. All facilities are given to the small complete units, namely the living beings, to enable them to realize the complete whole. The human form of life is obtained after evolving through 84 lakh species of life. After evolving through 84 lakh material bodies, we get this precious human body, which is meant for developing God consciousness. So we have also seen this shloka, which describes the 84 lakh species. Srila Prabhupada often refers to this 84 lakh species as the 84 lakh apartments, because Krishna gives us, the conditioned souls, different apartments to reside in for us to enjoy sense gratification. However, when we obtain the human form of life, there is an added responsibility for us to develop God consciousness. Also, the only difference between us and animals is that we have the ability to engage in spiritual inquiry and to develop God consciousness. Otherwise, we are the same as animals, because we'll also be engaged in the business of eating, sleeping, mating, and defending. Because we don't know that there is a complete arrangement in nature, we make efforts to utilize the resources of nature to create so-called complete life of sense enjoyment. The living entity cannot enjoy the life of the senses without being dovetailed with the complete whole. The hand of a body is a complete unit only as long as it is attached to the complete body. Similarly, living beings are part and parcel of the complete whole. The illusory representation of completeness cannot fully satisfy them. So we, being parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord, we can never be satisfied unless we satisfy the Supreme Lord. Because we are parts of the Supreme Lord, only when the complete whole is satisfied, only then we, as his parts and parcels, can be satisfied. So mere so-called sense gratification through these material senses, they cannot satisfy us. But the essence of Krishna consciousness is all about using the same set of material senses to be engaged in devotional service. So as long as we use our material senses to engage in devotional service to satisfy the Supreme Lord, we can also feel complete satisfaction. The completeness of human life can be realized only when one engages in the service of the complete whole. When everything is dovetailed with the complete whole, the attached parts and parcels also become complete in themselves. So in Gita 15.7, Krishna says, Mamayanso Jiva Loke, Jiva Bhuta Sanatana, Manashasta Indriyani, Prakrishtani Karshati. Krishna acknowledges that we are all his eternal fragmental parts, but due to conditioned life, we are struggling very hard with the six senses, which include the mind. So we are supposed to be originally, our original identity is that we are eternal fragmental parts of Krishna, but due to our conditioning to enjoy sense gratification, we are actually struggling. But we can only feel complete satisfaction by being engaged in devotional service, as mentioned in this verse from Bhagavatam, Savai Pumsam Parodharmo, Yado Bhakti Adoksache, Ahai Tuki Apratiyata Yatma Suprasidati. The supreme occupation, dharma for all humanity, is that by which man can attain to loving devotional service unto the transcendent Lord. Such devotional service must be unmotivated and uninterrupted to completely satisfy the self. So we can satisfy ourselves not through material sense gratification, through the mundane type of sense gratification, but only through devotional service, using the same set of material senses that we have been blessed with. So if we use our same set of material senses to engage in Shravanam, Kirtanam, and the Navayuddha Bhakti, so only then we can feel complete satisfaction. There's also another verse from Bhagavatam in the 4th canto, which is spoken by Narada Muni. So in that verse, Narada Muni advises the Prajita's to engage in devotional service. Yata taru mula nisechanena tripyanti tatskanda bhujopashaka pranopahara cha yatindriyanam tataiva sarvaranam achyuteja. So just as watering the roots nourishes the entire tree, just as supplying food to the stomach nourishes the entire body, similarly, worshipping Achyuta or the Supreme Lord Krishna satisfies all the demigods, but it is not that only the demigods will be satisfied, since we are also parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord. So through devotional service, when the Supreme Lord is satisfied, only then we ourselves can also be satisfied. So it is not through mundane sense gratification that we can feel satisfaction. It is only through devotional service. So the onus is on us to make use of our material senses to engage in devotional service. Therefore, we should avoid using our material senses to engage in mundane sense gratification. So the process prescribed through Krishna consciousness makes it much easier, where we simply have to use our senses to engage in chanting and hearing. So we have seen the purport of the invocation mantra. So now we'll be looking at the first mantra of Īśāvāsyam, which is based on the theme that the Supreme Ruler dwells in all. The first mantra, Īśāvāsyam Idaḿ Sarvaṁ Yat Kincha Jagatyam Jagat Tena Tyaktena Bunjita Ma Grida Kasya Svidhanam. Everything animate or inanimate that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside as his quota, and one should not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong. So this is the first mantra out of the 18 mantras in Īśāvāsyam. And the first line of this mantra, Īśāvāsyam Idaḿ Sarvaṁ, that itself it captures the entire essence of this Upanishad. It talks about the Īśāvāsya principle, where we have to acknowledge the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord, and we should only consume or enjoy what is meant to be our quota, because everything belongs to the Supreme Lord. So we have to be very cautious about what we do, and basically acting based on the Īśāvāsya principle helps us to avoid kama, krodha, lobha. as mentioned in Gita 16.21, lust, anger, greed, they are the three gateways to hell. So as long as we act according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, we can avoid those gates to hell. The purport for the first mantra: Vedic knowledge is infallible because it comes down through perfect disciplinary succession of spiritual masters, beginning with the Lord himself. The words spoken by the Lord are called Apaurushaya. So the Shabda Pramana from Vedic scriptures are Apaurushaya compared to knowledge that is created through mental speculation. A living being who lives in the mundane world has 4 defects. He is certain to commit mistakes, subject to illusion, has cheating propensity, and imperfect senses. No one with these 4 imperfections can deliver perfect knowledge. So apart from the Shabda Pramana of Vedic knowledge, all other forms of knowledge created through mental speculation are fallible. So to get Apaurushaya knowledge that is infallible, we have to get it through the bona fide parampara. And we belong to the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, which is a bona fide parampara with great acharyas like Madhvacharya and Srila Prabhupada. So only by joining a bona fide sampradaya, we can get infallible knowledge. Otherwise, we will be stuck with the mental speculation that is subject to these 4 imperfections. Since the Lord is Purnam, all perfect, there's no possibility of his being subjected to the laws of material nature, which he controls. This Īśāvāsyam is part of the Yajurveda, so it concerns the proprietorship of all things existing within the universe. So the Supreme Lord is infallible because he is not conditioned by the material nature, because the material nature itself is a byproduct of his material energy. So as mentioned in Gita 7.12, Krishna says, know that all states of being, be they of goodness, passion, or ignorance, are manifested by my energy. I am in one sense everything, but I am independent. I am not under the modes of material nature, for they, on the contrary, are within me. The 3 modes of material nature are mere byproducts of the material energy of Krishna. So he is not subject to those modes of material nature. So this itself confirms it completely justifies the Dvaita philosophy, because in our Sampradaya, we follow the Dvaita school of thought compared to Advaita, in which it is mentioned that the Jiva Brahman or living beings are the same as the Supreme Brahman. In Dvaita, we follow that the Jiva Brahman and Param Brahman are distinct. So we are subject to the material energy. Actually, the 3 modes of material nature, they are actually the byproducts of the Supreme Lord's material energy. So how can we be equal to the Supreme Lord? Also in 7.13, Krishna says, deluded by the 3 modes, the whole world does not know me, who am above the modes and inexhaustible. So whether it is from the Upanishads or even from the Bhagavad Gita, the Dvaita thought, the Dvaita philosophy is completely justified, where the Supreme Brahman is distinguished from the Jiva Brahman. Like we as living entities, we are Jiva Brahmans, and there's also the Mad Brahma, which refers to material nature. So all these are distinct from the Supreme Brahman. So we have so many, we as Jivas, we have so many fallibilities. So the essence of the Upanishads clearly establish the Dvaita philosophy. The Lord's proprietorship is mentioned in Gita 7.4.5. The elements of nature all belong to the Lord's inferior material energy, whereas the living being is his superior energy. But though originally we belong to the superior energy of the Lord, since we are in this conditioned state, being engaged in this material body, so we actually belong to the marginal energy known as Tatastha Shakti. So these are the three energies of the Supreme Lord: superior spiritual energy, inferior material energy, and marginal energy, Tatastha Shakti. So the spiritual energy consists of the three features: Satchit Ananda or Sandini Samvit Ladini. The material energy, which is considered inferior, is described in Gita 7.4. Then in 7.5, it talks about the marginal energy, meaning the conditioned souls. Though we are originally spirit souls, we belong to the superior energy, superior spiritual energy, but due to our conditioned state, we are actually now trapped in this marginal energy, which is between the superior and inferior energy. Because the Supreme Being is the complete person, he has complete and perfect intelligence to adjust everything by means of his different potencies. The Supreme Being is often compared to a fire, which can distribute energies in the form of heat and light. He is the possessor of all potencies, the knower of everything, the benefactor of everyone. He is full of inconceivable opulence, power, fame, beauty, knowledge, and renunciation. So again, in many of the purports of not just Īśāvāsyam, even in the other Upanishads like Kena and Katha Upanishads, we can see that the distinct quality of the Supreme Brahman is described, and we can clearly see how inferior are we as jivas. We are mere fragmental parts of the Supreme Brahman. So it is completely unjustified to say that the Jiva Brahman or the living entity can be equal to the Supreme Brahman. So even regarding these opulences, the 6 opulences, the Supreme Brahman or Bhagavan, he has all these 6 opulences in abundance. So we as jivas, we hardly have 1 or 2, and that too only to a limited quantity. One should therefore be intelligent enough to know that except for the Lord, no one is a proprietor of anything. Though we as conditioned souls, due to our false ego, we tend to think of ourselves as enjoyers and controllers. But the truth is that there's only one supreme proprietor, and we can never even think of being equal to him. One should accept only those things that are set aside by the Lord as his quota. For example, our dwelling, which is made of earth, wood, stone, iron, cement, and so many other material things. If we think in terms of Īśāvāsyam, we must know that we cannot produce any of these building materials ourselves. We can simply bring them together and transform them into different shapes by our labor. A laborer cannot claim to be a proprietor of a thing just because he has worked hard to manufacture it. So within this material universe, which is composed of the 24 elements of creation, everything originates from the material energy of the Supreme Lord. The material energy of the Supreme Lord itself is merely 1/4 of his total energy. So even to construct anything, to create or invent anything in this material world, we still have to rely on the raw materials provided by the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Proprietor. Whether it is the material stuff or even our senses, our jnana indriyas and karma indriyas, these are also part of the material energy of the Supreme Lord. So he is the Supreme Proprietor. So how can we even think about being equal to him? We are merely parts and parcels of the Supreme Lord, who is the complete whole. In modern society, there's always a great quarrel between the laborers and capitalists. Īśāvāsyam can deliver the message of Godhead to man through bona fide acharyas. The human race should take the Vedic wisdom of Īśāvāsyam and not quarrel over material possessions. One must be satisfied with whatever privileges are given to him by the mercy of the Lord. So the essence of understanding this Īśāvāsyam principle is to understand that there's only one Supreme Proprietor, and we must acknowledge the fact that we can only use our quota, which is meant for us. So simply by understanding this Īśāvāsyam principle, a lot of problems can be avoided. However, since this age of Kali is known as the age of quarrel and hypocrisy, so it is quite difficult to even impart this knowledge about the Īśāvāsyam principle. If they do not recognize the proprietorship of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, all the property they claim to be their own is stolen. Consequently, they will be liable to punishment by the laws of nature. Human beings are not meant to quarrel like cats and dogs. They must be intelligent enough to realize the importance and aim of human life. So again, in the Bhagavad Gita, there are these verses like Manushyanam Sahasresu Kaschit Yatati Sittaye Yatatam Mati Api Siddhanam Kaschin Mam Veti Tatvataha. Out of many thousands among men, one may endeavor for perfection, and of those who have achieved perfection, hardly one knows me in truth. So previously we saw that regarding the 84 lakh species of living beings, we get this human form of life after going through the 84 lakh species. And even after gaining this human form of life, which is meant for developing God consciousness, Krishna himself says that it is very rare to find a person who knows Krishna in truth out of many thousands among men. Though we may endeavor for perfection, still Krishna says that it is difficult for even those who endeavor for perfection to know him in truth. Also in 7.19, Krishna says, Bhavanam Janmanam Ante Jnanavan Mam Prapadyate Vasudeva Sarvamiti Samaatma Sudurlabha. After many births and deaths, he who is actually in knowledge surrenders unto me, knowing me to be the cause of all causes and all that is. Such a great soul is very rare. So, though the human life is meant for developing God consciousness, still it is not easy to know Krishna. So, it is not easy even for those who endeavor. So, just imagine about those who give various excuses to avoid being engaged in devotional service, saying that they have no time and so many other excuses. So they are merely degrading their precious human form of life. Animals, birds, reptiles, and other low life forms strictly adhere to the laws of nature. Therefore, there is no question of sin for them, nor are the Vedic instructions meant for them. Human life alone is a life of responsibility. Since we have gained this human form of life, which is a precious form, as acknowledged by Brahma and the demigods in Bhagavatam, Canto 3, even Brahma and demigods, they acknowledge the fact that the human form of life is very precious, because though we are trapped in this earth planet, if we endeavor to be completely absorbed in devotional service, we can be promoted to the spiritual world, even without having to go to the upper worlds. So that's why this human life is a life of responsibility, and those conditioned souls that are trapped in lower forms of life, there's no question of sin for them. Like when a tiger preys on other other animals. There's no sin for the tiger because it has no such consciousness to understand what is sin and what is pious action. But we as human beings who have this ability to develop God consciousness, we have the extra responsibility. And that's why we should always adhere to the teachings in the scriptures, especially even when it comes to our food habits. So that is why it is even if we consider regarding the food habits, we should only consume what is meant for us to maintain our human body, so we can simply maintain our body by eating grains and vegetables. However, merely being a vegetarian is not enough because even vegetables have life. So that's why everything must be dovetailed in devotional service to the Supreme Lord. A human being is therefore required to recognize the authority of the Supreme Lord and become his devotee. He must offer everything for the Lord's service and partake only the remnants of food offered to the Lord. In Gita 9.26, the Lord directly states that he accepts vegetarian food from the hands of a pure devotee. Therefore, a human being should not only become a strict vegetarian, but should also become a devotee of the Lord, offer the Lord all his food, and then partake of such prasadam or the mercy of the Lord. Those who do not offer their food to the Lord eat nothing but sin and subject themselves to various types of distress, which are the results of sin. So the conception of pious action and sin applies strictly to human beings because only we have this ability to distinguish between right and wrong. So we have been blessed with that consciousness to develop God consciousness. So the onus is on us to behave responsibly. So in Gita 3.13 stated, Yajna Santo Muchanti Sarva Kilvishe Bunjate Te Tvagam Papa Ye Pachanti Atma Karanat. The devotees of the Lord are released from all kinds of sins because they eat food which is offered first for sacrifice. Others who prepare food for personal sense enjoyment verily eat only sin. So such actions bind us and they prohibit us from being liberated from this material world. In 9.26, Krishna says, if one offers me with love and devotion a leaf, a flower, a fruit, or water, I will accept it. Also in 9.27, Krishna says, Yat karosi, yat ashnashi. So specifically, Krishna is mentioning about whatever you eat, apart from offering whatever we do. Krishna is also emphasizing that we should also offer him whatever we eat to nullify all the sinful reactions, because even by consuming vegetables, there is the sinful reaction. So that's why it is important to offer our food to the Supreme Lord. The root of sin is deliberate disobedience to the laws of nature through disregarding the proprietorship of the Lord. So merely by understanding the Īśāvāsyam principle in this first mantra of Īśāvāsyam, we can understand the basics of recognizing the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord, and automatically there will be no tendencies to develop lust, greed, or anger. So that's why it is important for us to recognize the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord, because the entire material creation, whether it is the entire creation, whether it is the material world or the spiritual world, everything belongs to him. So if we transgress the laws of material nature, which are actually just part of the Supreme Lord's creation, so that's when all the problems start. So merely by engaging in devotional service based on the Īśāvāsyam principle. So even in Gita 9.27, when Krishna says, Yat karosi, yat asnashi, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer as charity, whatever you offer for sacrifices, so do everything as an offering to me. So that is how we can actually acknowledge the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. So if we acknowledge that the Supreme Lord owns everything, then we can automatically avoid from being greedy, and we will always be conscious of consuming everything by acknowledging the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord. Everything animate or inanimate that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside as his quota. So apart from that, there are also other important verses from the Gita which talk about how the Supreme Lord pervades and also owns everything else. Like in Gita 509, Krishna says, Bhoktaram yakin tapsam sarvaloka maheshwaram suldam sarvabhutanam nyatva mam shantim rachati. So Krishna is the ultimate beneficiary of all sacrifices and austerities, the Supreme Lord of all planets and demigods, and the benefactor and well-wisher of all living entities. Surdam Sarvabhutanam. So how does Krishna claim to be the well-wisher of all living entities? In chapter 13 of Gita, the chapter starts with Arjuna's inquiries. Arjuna asks questions about the 6 aspects: Prakriti, Purusha, Kshetra, Kshetranya, Jnanam, Nyayam. Arjuna wants to know about Prakriti, nature, Purusha, the enjoyer, Kshetram, field, Kshetranya, knower of the field, Jnanam, knowledge, Nyayam, object of knowledge. Arjuna starts the chapter with these questions about these 6 aspects, to which Krishna answers that the body is called the field. The one who knows the body is called the knower of the field. So we have our material body, which is the field, and our spirit soul is the knower of the field or the material body, but our knowledge about our body is only limited to our own field. But Krishna also says that he is also the knower in all bodies. As the Paramatma, he is the knower in all bodies, and that's why he says that he is the well-wisher of all living entities. He is present as Paramatma in the hearts of all living entities, not just human beings. So that's why he is the well-wisher of all living entities, and that's why he is the supreme controller. He is the supreme proprietor and the controller of even the living entities, even the conditioned living entities. In Gita 13.23, Krishna says, Upadrasta anumanta cha balta bhokta maheshwara paramatmeti chapyukta deesmin purusha para. Krishna is the transcendental enjoyer, who is the Lord, supreme proprietor, who exists as the overseer and permitter, and who is known as the super soul. The Paramatma is actually the overseer and permitter. With Krishna being present in our hearts as Paramatma, he knows exactly everything that is happening. Even within our mind, he knows what we wish for and everything, and therefore he is the overseer and permitter. He decides what is best for us, and he grants us our wishes. So that's how he is the well-wisher of all living entities. So he owns us and he controls the entire creation. Well, not just the material nature, we are also parts and parcels. We are the Jiva Brahma. We are the Jiva Brahmans of the Param Brahma, the Supreme Brahman. Therefore, that's why we owe everything to the Supreme Lord. That's why it is even more important for us to understand the supreme proprietorship and always act according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. Apart from that, in chapter 15, Purushottam Yoga in Gita, Krishna says, Yat aditya katham tejo jagat bhasyade ekalam, yat chandramasi chaknav tat tejo iti mamakam. The splendor of the sun, which dissipates the darkness of this whole world, comes from me. And the splendor of the moon and the splendor of fire are also from me. So even in other Upanishads like Taittiriya and Aitareya Upanishad, there are descriptions about how all the various demigods like Surya Dev, Agni Dev, and Vayu, how they all originate from the Supreme Lord. And since all these demigods are also part of this material world, Krishna is also present as Paramatma within those demigods. For example, in the demigod Surya, Krishna is present as Surya Narayan. So that's why even when we engage in demigod worship, it is not that demigod worship is completely prohibited. It's not that demigod worship is completely prohibited, but we still have to conduct demigod worship according to the proper understanding. We must understand that even the demigods gain their power from the Supreme Lord. So even when we worship the demigods, we have to worship that Supreme Lord who is present within the demigods. So that's how the Supreme Lord, who is the Supreme Proprietor, pervades the entire creation, including the demigods. So even in our sessions on Madhyaloka, when we saw descriptions about the Shaptadvipas, beyond Jambudvipa, in the other Dvipas, the inhabitants there, they also worship the demigods, but they worship the demigods by worshipping the Supreme Lord who is present within those demigods. So that should be the proper understanding even when we engage in demigod worship. Also, Krishna says in 15.13, I enter into each planet and by my energy they stay in orbit. I become the moon and thereby supply the juice of life to all vegetables. So even the descriptions regarding the planet Soma, this is also available in the other Upanishads like Taittiriya. So even the energy that is present in the vegetables, those are provided by the Supreme Lord. Apart from that, Krishna says that I am the fire of digestion in the bodies of all living entities, and I join with the air of life, outgoing and incoming, to digest the 4 kinds of foodstuff. So again, this description regarding Vaishvanaro, which is another name for Agni Dev, there's also this description in the other Upanishads. So we can clearly see that not just the food that we eat, even to digest our food, we need the energy of the Supreme Lord. So how can we not acknowledge his supreme proprietorship? And how can we even think to be equal to him when he is at such an exalted position where he owns and controls everything? How can we even think about being equal to him? So that's why all the Upanishads completely justify the Dvaita philosophy, and also monotheism, which focuses on the Supreme Brahman being the supreme proprietor and controller of everything. And apart from that, in 15.15, Krishna says, Sarvasyam Hriti Sanivista, I'm seated in everyone's heart as the super soul. Apart from that, in 18.61, Ishvara Sarva Bhutanam, the Supreme Lord is situated in everyone's heart and is directing the wanderings of all living entities who are seated as on a machine made of the material energy. Also in Keno Upanishad, which is also known as Talavakra Upanishad, there are descriptions regarding how the Supreme Lord directs the way how we as living entities function. There are descriptions about how the Supreme Lord controls the operations of our mind and senses, about how the Mukhya Prana operates. So these descriptions are there in Keno Upanishad. And apart from that, in Katha Upanishad, there are also descriptions about how the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Brahman, continues to control us even after death and liberation. So even after we get liberation, we are still dependent on the Supreme Lord. So it is not like we can free ourselves from the control of the Supreme Lord. Whether we are in this material world, in the conditioned state, or even after liberation, we will always remain under the control of the Supreme Lord. So that's why it is extremely important to understand the Īśāvāsyam principle and acknowledge the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Brahman. So now the second mantra, which focuses on the theme of do your duty with dedication to God. The second mantra, Kurvaneveya karmani jijivishek chatam samaha evantai nanyate tochi asti na karma lipsyate nare. One may aspire to live for hundreds of years if he continuously goes on working in that way, for that sort of work will not bind him to the law of karma. There is no alternative to this way for man. So here it is stated that one may aspire to live for hundreds of years if he continuously goes on working in that way, meaning to continuously work according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. If we are engaged in our material duties and also in our devotional service, according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, we may aspire to live for hundreds of years without being worried about material bondage. As long as we direct our actions according to the Īśāvāsyam principle by acknowledging the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord, we do not have to be worried about being bound by the material bondage. There is a hard struggle for life by all kinds of living entities. The living being is eternal by nature, but due to his bondage in material existence, he has to change his body over and over. This process is called transmigration of the soul, or karma bandhana, bondage by one's work. So we keep going through this transmigration of our soul through different material bodies due to our material bondage. So the only way to liberate ourselves from this material bondage is by acting according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. In Gita 2.12, Krishna says, never was there a time when I did not exist, nor you, nor all these kings, nor in future shall any of us cease to be. So here Krishna is referring to the spirit soul. So the spirit souls are eternal and fragmental parts of the Supreme Lord. But in Gita 2.13, Krishna says, as the embodied soul continuously passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. A sober person is not bewildered by such a change. So the same spirit soul, the eternal spirit soul, continuously goes through the changing bodies, not just changing from one form of body to another, but even while being encaged in this human body, we are going through so many changes during every moment. Then 2.20 again talks about the characteristics of the eternal spirit soul, for which there's neither birth nor death at any time. However, when death occurs, it is not like the soul gets destroyed, but we merely leave the current body and take up another body. But this transmigration of the soul to different material bodies will continue as long as we do not act according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. If we direct all our actions by acknowledging the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord, then we can liberate ourselves from the material bondage and also elevate ourselves to the spiritual world. Since this mantra is related to how we must act according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. So it is also important to understand the distinction between karma, akarma, and vikarma. Karma refers to the prescribed duties according to the scriptural injunctions. Akarma are actions that free one from the cycle of birth and death. If we perform karmas, though they are prescribed duties, if we perform karmas with obsession or attachment to the fruits of actions, so that binds us to this material bondage. And because of that, we'll have to be stuck in the transmigration of the soul through different bodies. But by performing akarma, we can liberate ourselves. And vikarma is, it refers to the forbidden actions according to the scriptural injunctions. So it is always important for us to engage in akarma, which liberates us. And we must also guide our actions according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. In Gita 3.9 to 16, the personality of Godhead says that one cannot attain the state of Naishkarmya or Akarma without executing the prescribed duties mentioned in the Vedic literature. This literature can regulate the working energy of a human being in such a way that he can gradually realize the authority of the Supreme Being. When he realizes the authority of the personality of Godhead, he has attained the stage of positive knowledge. In this purified stage, the modes of nature cannot act, and he is able to work on the basis of Naishkarmya. Such work does not bind one to the cycle of birth and death. So the two mantras, the first mantra, which spoke about the Īśāvāsyam principle, and this mantra focuses on Naishkarmya or Nishkama Karma. They are related because if we guide our actions according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, we can train ourselves to work according to Naishkarmya or Akarma, where we will be detached from the fruits of action. We will not be too attached to the fruits of actions, and by training ourselves to work according to material bondage. So that is what is mentioned in Gita 3.9 to 16. Work done as a sacrifice for Vishnu has to be performed, otherwise work causes bondage in this material world. So this is also quite similar to what Krishna mentions in 9.27 about how it is important for us to continue working, but we offer all the fruits of actions to Krishna. So the significance of performing our works as a sacrifice is especially important because in the beginning of creation, the Lord of all creatures sent forth generations of men and demigods along with sacrifices for Vishnu and blessed them by saying, "Be thou happy by this yajna sacrifice, because its performance will bestow upon you everything desirable for living happily and achieving liberation." The demigods, being pleased by sacrifices, will also please you, and thus by cooperation between men and demigods, prosperity will reign for all. So there must always be this cooperation between all living entities within this material universe, whether it is between us and the demigods or between men and animals. We must all live in harmony by acknowledging the supreme proprietorship of the Supreme Lord. In charge of the various necessities of life, the demigods, being satisfied by the performance of yajna, sacrifice, will supply all necessities to you. But he who enjoys such gifts without offering them to the demigods in return is certainly a thief. So the demigods are empowered by the Supreme Lord. They are doing their duties as they have been empowered. So we must also please the demigods in return. And even by doing so, we are acknowledging the Īśāvāsyam principle. We are acknowledging the supreme proprietorship. But even when we worship the demigods, we worship that Supreme Lord who had actually empowered the demigods to provide us with all the resources. So regarding this 3.13, we have already seen the meaning. about how it is important to free ourselves from sinful reactions by offering our food to the Supreme Lord. Also in 3.14, it is stated that all living bodies subsist on food grains which are produced from rains. Rains are produced by performance of yajna, and yajna is born of prescribed duties. There are also more detailed descriptions regarding this about how when we consume the food grains, they are consumed and they form the retas, and how the living beings are formed. So there are further descriptions about this in the other Upanishads. So even the food that we eat, and also to digest our food, we still rely on the energy of the Supreme Lord. Though the so-called rationalists and atheists may attribute it to nature, even the material nature is part of the Lord's energy. So that is why we must guide our actions by acknowledging the Supreme Proprietor. Regulated activities are prescribed in the Vedas, and the Vedas are directly manifested from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Consequently, the all-pervading transcendence is eternally situated in the acts of sacrifice. My dear Arjuna, one who does not follow in human life the cycle of sacrifice, thus established by the Vedas, certainly leads a life full of sin. Living only for the satisfaction of the senses, such a person lives in vain. So again, we can see that the meaning conveyed through these verses in the Gita are also related to the first two mantras. First, in the first mantra, it talks about how important it is to realize the Īśāvāsyam principle. And beyond that, we must also guide our actions according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. So the same purport of the two mantras are also conveyed through these verses in the Gita. Factually, no one has to do anything more than render devotional service to the Lord. So as long as we act according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, we can also perform our material duties as an offering to the Supreme Lord, and that itself becomes like devotional service. A conditioned soul is accustomed to working for sense gratification, for his own selfish interests, immediate or extended. But the Vedic instruction of Īśāvāsyam is that if one actually wants to live for any other purpose apart from God-centric purposes, it is actually like transgressing the teachings of the Vedic injunctions. There's no harm in becoming a family man or an altruist, socialist, communist, nationalist, or a humanitarian, provided that one executes his activities in relation with Īśāvāsyam, the God-centered conception. So even while being engaged in our material duties, we can still make it God-centric by acting according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. In Gita 2.40, Lord Krishna states that God-centered activities are so valuable that just a few of them can save a person from the greatest danger. And what is this greatest danger? Is to get degraded to a lower position. Now that we have obtained this human form of life, we are very fortunate. But if we do not utilize this present human form of life, and if we get degraded to lower forms of life, that is the greatest danger. So we can avoid that danger by being by acting according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. So even if we do not even if we do not manage to get liberated to the spiritual world in this life, so we can still be qualified to get another human form of life to complete our devotional service. But for that, we must also endeavor within this lifetime. So the purport of the second mantra is also conveyed through these verses. In 2.39, Krishna says, Now listen as I explain it in terms of working without fruitive results. When you act in such knowledge, you can free yourself from the bondage of works. In this endeavor, there's no loss or diminution, and a little advancement on this path can protect one from the most dangerous type of fear. So simply by working according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, we can avoid being bound by material bondage, and that will prevent us from being degraded to the lower forms of life. Also in 2.47, Karmanyavadhikaraste ma phalesu kadachana ma karma phala heturvur mate sangosto karmani. You have a right to perform your prescribed duty, but you are not entitled to the fruits of action. Never consider yourself the cause of the results of your activities and never be attached to not doing your duty. So our only business is to focus on how to do our duty without being too obsessed about the fruits of action. That is the only way we can perform akarma. Only when we are detached from the fruits of action, only then we can cultivate the Īśāvāsyam principle and completely avoid material bondage. Even if we do not manage to complete our devotional service in this life, we can still we can at least get ourselves qualified for another human form of life to complete our unfinished business. If we don't take things seriously in this life, so then we are disqualifying ourselves from gaining another human form of life. Of course, it is best to get it done in this life itself, but we must also make sure that even if we don't get it done in this life, we must still make sure that we are qualified enough to complete our unfinished business in another human form of life. So that is only possible if we act according to the Īśāvāsyam principle. Also in Gita 18.14, Krishna says, Adhishthānam tata karta karanam cha pratak vidam vidasta pratak chesta devam chaivarta panchamam. There are 5 factors of action: the place of action, body, the performer, the spirit soul, the various senses or material senses, the many kinds of different kinds of endeavor, and ultimately the super soul. We have already seen how we are fallible beings since we have the propensity for cheating, being illusion, imperfect senses. So how is it that despite so many fallibilities, how is it that we are actually able to come up with success in life? How is it that we are still successful at doing something apart from despite having so many imperfections? It is only because of the mercy of the Supreme Lord. The 5th factor, which we often tend to ignore and deny. The fact is that we are able to achieve success in this material life only due to the mercy of the Supreme Lord, who is the 5th factor, but we often refuse to acknowledge him, to simply deny him any credit. But the fact remains that despite all our drawbacks and fallibilities, it is only due to the mercy of the Supreme Lord that we are able to attain success in our material life. And that's why it is important for us to always remain detached from the fruits of action, because it is only due to the mercy of the Supreme Lord that we are getting the favorable results. But even if we don't get what we desire, the Supreme Lord has his own plans. So that's why, again, it is important that we have to acknowledge the Supreme Proprietor, even when we are engaged in our material duties. Perform your duty equipoised, O Arjuna, abandoning all attachment to success or failure. Such equanimity is called yoga. O Dhananjaya, keep all abominable activities far distant by devotional service, and in that consciousness surrender unto the Lord. Those who want to enjoy the fruits of their work are misers. So being too attached or obsessed to the fruits of action will only cause further bondage, because of which we'll have to be stuck in this material world. A man engaged in devotional service rids himself of both good and bad reactions even in this life. Therefore, strive for yoga, which is the art of all work. So even if we perform our material duties according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, that itself becomes like devotional service to the Supreme Lord. So that will liberate us from further bondage. One who performs his duty without attachment, surrendering the results unto the Supreme Lord, is unaffected by sinful action, as the lotus leaf is untouched by water. So again, we can see that all these verses from the Gita are related to the second mantra of the Īśāvāsyam. When altruistic activities are executed in the spirit of Īśāvāsyam, they become a form of karma yoga. Such activities are recommended in Gita 18.5 to 9. Even though such God-centered activities may be half finished, they are still good for the executor because they will guarantee him a human form in his next birth. So even if we don't complete our devotional service in this life, we must make sure that we don't get degraded to lower forms of life. We must still at least make sure that we are qualified enough to get another human form of life to complete our unfinished business. So that is also stated by Krishna in chapter 6, towards the end of the chapter. The unsuccessful yogi, after many years of enjoyment on the planets of the pious living entities, is born into a family of righteous people or into a family of rich aristocracy. So by adhering to the Īśāvāsyam principle and by acting according to that principle, even if we do not complete our devotional service activities in this life, we still don't have to be worried, because we can still qualify ourselves to get another human form of life to complete our unfinished business. But if we do not act according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, we will get degraded to lower forms of life, which is most unfortunate. So that's how the first two mantras are related, and they are also related to many of these verses from the Gita. 6.42, or if unsuccessful after long practice of yoga, he takes birth in a family of transcendentalists who are surely great in wisdom. Certainly, such a birth is rare in this world. On taking such a birth, he revives the divine consciousness of his previous life, and he again tries to make further progress in order to achieve complete success. By virtue of the divine consciousness of his previous life, Purva Abhyasena, whatever we do in our present form of life, even if we do not manage to complete our devotional service in this life, merely by acting according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, whatever we have done in this life will still be useful in our next life. So by virtue of Purva Abhyas, the yogi becomes automatically attracted to yogic principles even without seeking them. Such an inquisitive transcendentalist stands always above the ritualistic principles of the scriptures. And when the yogi engages himself with sincere endeavor in making further progress, being washed of all contaminations, then ultimately achieving perfection after many births of practice, he attains the supreme goal. So whether we attain the supreme destination after this life, or even if we don't, if we stick to the Īśāvāsyam principle, success is guaranteed, though it may be delayed. Also, in the last chapter of the Gita, Arjuna asked Krishna about the distinction between sannyasa and tyaga, to which Krishna summarizes everything, that the renounced order of life, to give up actions, is called sannyasa, but tyaga, which is even more important than sannyasa, is to renounce the results of activities. So it is perfectly okay to perform activities, but it is more important to renounce the fruits of actions. So that's how, again, these verses from the Gita are related to the Īśāvāsyam mantras 1 and 2. Also in 18.48, Krishna says, Sahajam karma kaunteya sadosam apina tyajet sarvarambai doshena dhume nagri iva vrata. Every endeavor is covered by some fault, just as fire is covered by smoke. Therefore, one should not give up the work born of his nature, O son of Kunti, even if such work is full of fault. So this is not only important in our material duties, it is even more important in our devotional service. We see so many people giving excuses like they don't have time to engage in devotional service now, so they're waiting for retirement age. But even by the time they attain retirement age, by that time they'll be too busy with the hospital appointments. So for such people, even this one human form of life may not be enough. Even if they are given another human form of life, still they might give the same excuses. So why should Krishna give such privileges for those who cannot appreciate it? There are 84 lakh apartments. So if we are unable to appreciate this prestigious apartment, which is the human form of life, then why would Krishna repeatedly give us this? Even at least if we endeavor according to the Īśāvāsyam principle, at least in this life, then at least we can make sure that we are qualified to receive another human form of life in the next birth. Hopefully that is not the case for all the devotees, but still, if we do not manage to attain success in this form of life, still success is guaranteed after attaining another human form of life. But for those who do not appreciate this human form of life, and if they keep giving excuses to simply avoid devotional service, so for such people, even another 100 human lives may not be enough, because they are simply going to repeat by giving the same excuses. So that's why it is important to at least start chanting a few rounds and get started immediately, regardless of whatever faults there may be. So that's how we can at least start or even resume our journey back to Goloka, to go to Goloka, back to Godhead. So that's all for today's session. So the main focus in today's session, and also for the upcoming sessions, we'll be looking at how the contents of Īśāvāsyam are actually related to the Bhagavad Gita. So we'll be looking at how the Bhagavad Gita is the essence of all the Upanishads. So thanks for attending today's session. Any questions or comments?
No, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Okay, happy birthday, Yadkash Prabhu. Okay, so any questions? Okay, so if there are no questions, so we'll meet again next week. Thank you. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.